Hi, my name is Mike McKenna, and I'm a patient educator here at NeuroPace with the patient education team. You're here today because your doctors have mentioned that the NeuroPace's RNS system might be a potential option for you. Or maybe you already said yes to RNS and you're getting ready to schedule your RNS surgery. Either scenario, I'm sure you have many questions. This education session is designed to provide you with answers to your important questions so that you can make an informed and educated decision when discussing RNS with your doctors, or also to help you know what to expect once you get home with your RNS system. Sharing a little bit about myself, I was diagnosed with epilepsy over 30 years ago, and I've been living with the RNS system myself for close to 17 years. During today's discussion, I'll be sharing some of my experiences living with RNS, including how the RNS system was used in my overall epilepsy and wellness care. So let's get started learning about the RNS system. The RNS system is composed of different components that we'll be covering today. One of those components is the Neurostimulator. I'll refer to this as the RNS device throughout our talk. This device, just for reference, if you were to stack 3 quarters on top of each other, that is the thickness of the device. And if you were to lay 2.5 quarters next to each other, that is the width and length of the device. It's a little bit bigger than a person's adult thumb. So if you look at your thumb right now, that's about the size of the device. Within there is the computer, the battery, everything is contained within there. So what the neurosurgeon will do is they will use a template, the same outline as that device. And then somewhere on the skull, they would use that template to remove a small section of bone. They replace that bone with a titanium tray that's securely attached to the skull. And that tray is recessed so that when they fit that RNS device within the tray's pocket, the top of the device sits flush with the bone. So there's no bump. No one can tell that you have anything in your head. And that tray and the device do not touch the brain. Attached to that device are 2 electrical leads that can be placed where the doctors have determined your seizures are originating from. So doctors can use what's called a depth lead that can go deeper in the brain if that's where your seizures are coming from. And doctors can also use what's called a cortical strip or a surface lead that can be placed on the surface of the brain. Doctors can also use a combination of these leads depending on your seizures. No matter what kind of electrical leads the doctors use, the RNS device is working the same way. So what it's doing is through those electrical leads, it's monitoring the brain 24 hours a day. It's like an ongoing intracranial EEG monitoring device, just constantly looking for seizures. When that device sees seizure activity, it's programmed to respond with pulses of stimulation to disrupt that seizure activity, to normalize the brainwaves. You cannot feel when that stimulation goes off, so you wouldn't have any idea that your RNS device is doing anything because you can't feel anything that way. On average, a person will receive about 3 to 4.5 minutes of stimulation per day. I know it doesn't sound like very much stimulation provided, but when you add up these millisecond pulses throughout the day, that could be hundreds of times that the RNS device responded to seizure activity. Even for stuff that you might not have been aware of that was going on in your head, the RNS device is also providing therapy to that. What this device does after it provides that stimulation, it then makes brain recordings of that seizure. And the way the device makes the recordings is first it provides that stimulation, and then the device will go backwards 60 seconds, goes forward 30 seconds, and stores these 90-second EEG recordings of that seizure. So you can think of these seizure recordings as your seizure fingerprints, like what your seizure activity looks like. Just like you have seizures and I have seizures, our seizure fingerprints are different, which means our RNS stimulation settings will be personalized to our unique seizure activity. So this is where your epilepsy doctor, using these recordings during one of your follow-up appointments, may say, hey, RNS device, instead of looking right here where you first saw this seizure, we want you to look backwards along this EEG recording, and when you see this brain seizure activity way back here, this is where we want you to provide stimulations. The doctors will adjust the stimulation parameters based on that earlier brain activity. So what happens over time when these adjustments are made is people start to experience their seizures not lasting as long, and many times the seizures are stopped is because the RNS device is starting to recognize that seizure activity earlier and providing that stimulation earlier. For many of us, we might experience seizures, like we're aware that something's going on and we're like, I want my doctors to take a look at this. This is where the RNS system also has the RNS Magnet. This magnet is about the size of an Oreo cookie. It's pretty small, thin. And this magnet is a useful tool. It's not something you have to use, but let's say you're going about your day and you notice an aura, like you're aware of seizure activity. If the magnet is near you, you can take it and you can swipe it over the RNS device, similar to like you're brushing your hair. First of all, when you swipe the magnet, it does not turn stimulation on, but what it does is it tells your RNS device that you want to timestamp that moment and make one of those 90-second brain recordings of that activity. So now your doctors will have a recording of what's called a clinical seizure, meaning it was something that you felt, you were aware of. Using that recording during your follow-up appointments, the doctors can say, hey, RNS device, this is where we want you to provide stimulation along this magnet recording to try to prevent that aura, that seizure that you were aware of, from continuing or potentially growing into something bigger. Also with that magnet recording, maybe the doctors discovered that that seizure that you felt, that you were aware of, maybe that grew out of seizure activity that was going on that you weren't even aware of that was going on. You know, it could have been like the seizure spiking that was a second or two, then it was gone. Could have been seizure activity that was like really low and slow, just kind of simmering there. Like it just hadn't gotten big enough yet that it came out as a clinical seizure, one that you felt. And if the doctors can see that seizure growth timeline, they could also tell that RNS device to go way back to those early seizures to try to prevent that aura from ever showing up. A lot of people feel like the RNS magnet is very similar to like if you're in the hospital, in the EMU, and they gave you that little red button and said, hey, push this if you feel anything. That's very similar to how the magnet works too. It's time stamping that moment. So we're talking about all this RNS data that's being collected, and this is going to give you and your doctors a better idea about like your seizure cycles and patterns and trends. You guys will be able to start seeing, do you have more seizures in your sleep versus the day? Do you have seizures going on throughout the day that you're not even aware of that's going on? Like this is where the RNS system is going to give you and your doctors a better idea about your seizure activity. All this data though, it's not telling the doctors like, oh, here's a seizure that I felt, here's one I didn't. This is what I was doing when this seizure happened. This is where you could use a seizure diary, keeping track of like what you were doing right before that seizure happened. You know, a seizure diary is a great way to kind of like put your voice into the data that the doctors are looking at. So let's say you go on about your day and you've noticed that aura, that feeling. You swipe your magnet. You put down in the seizure diary, like why you swiped your magnet, but also what you were doing before that seizure happened. And this is where you can keep track of key words, things like stress, anxiety, diet, like maybe high carbohydrates or caffeine, poor sleep, overexcitement, the weather. Was it really hot outside, really cold outside? This is where you can provide that feedback, like just jot down in that seizure diary what you were doing before that seizure. Bring that seizure diary to your appointments, and together with your RNS recordings, maybe you and your doctors discover some seizure triggers or some things in your life that increase your seizure activity. You know, having those insights allows you to adapt or change something in your life. Because maybe over time you guys go, wow, look at this. Every time we do this, there's a seizure. So how do we stop or reduce doing this? So it adds like another layer to your overall epilepsy and wellness care by providing some insights and some correlations to life activities that you might be able to adapt or change to avoid those seizure triggers. I'll share how a seizure diary was very useful for me. This was down in Phoenix, Arizona, where I was living. And through me using that seizure diary, we ended up discovering that anytime it got to 100 degrees or above, if I was out in that heat waiting for a bus, what would happen is about 2 hours after that, I'd get really tired, fall asleep, and have a seizure. I'd come out of it, think back, like what was I doing before that happened? And I could just write down the word hot in that seizure diary. As you know, I didn't have to explain what that meant in Phoenix. Brought that seizure diary to my appointments, and over time, we ended up seeing that heat stress was a seizure trigger for me. So what I was able to do with that information was I adapted my daily activities to start doing everything first thing in the morning to try to avoid the afternoon heat. Or if I was caught in the heat, I now knew I should drink water or electrolytes to try to stay cool, because now I knew heat was a seizure trigger. Through that diary, we also discovered anytime I ate a meal that was like a couple of plates of spaghetti and lots of French bread, like that was my go-to cheap Happy Meal that filled me up. But about an hour and a half after a meal like that, I'd get really tired, fall asleep, have a seizure. I'd come out of it, think back, what was I doing leading up to that? I didn't get to just write down the word pasta, like very generic term, covered everything carbs. Brought that diary to my appointments, and together with my RNS recordings and my input, we discovered that high carbohydrates was a seizure trigger for me. So having that information, I was able to adapt my diet to try to avoid meals that was nothing but carbs. So each time I reduced or removed a seizure trigger, and as my doctors made adjustments to my RNS stimulation settings for those seizure trigger spots in my brain, what that did was I noticed it lowered my brain's seizure sensitivity, so I was able to kind of like step back some from the next thing that normally would have thrown me into a full-blown seizure. It didn't affect me. For example, like poor quality sleep. That was another trigger for me. So through that seizure diary, what we also ended up discovering over time was it wasn't just one seizure trigger come along and boom, there was a seizure. It seemed like it had to be 2 or 3 seizure triggers all coming together for like that perfect seizure storm to happen. So I was able to reduce one of those triggers that lowered my chance of experiencing seizures. So that's how a seizure diary together with my RNS recordings really provided us some great insights to things that I was able to try to avoid or adapt.